The sky over the western horizon burned a furious red. It wasn't just the fading sun casting its final light across the rolling ridges. It was fire. A monstrous wildfire, alive and unforgiving, swept through the dry canyon lands of northern Arizona like a predator unchained. For days, the inferno had devoured everything in its path. Old pine forests, ancient rock formations, wildlife dens, even a few scattered ranch outposts. Now, it was heading toward the last line of resistance, the remote wilderness zone that fire crews had hoped would act as a natural barrier. But the winds had shifted, and the flames refused to be tamed. Hannah Brooks stood alone in the blaze-hazed clearing, her boots planted in scorched earth, surrounded by smoke thick enough to swallow sound. Her fire suit, caked in ash and sweat, clung heavily to her body as she adjusted the bandana across her face. The radio at her hip crackled occasionally. Ghost-like voices barking out coordinates and evacuation notices. Most of her crew had already retreated to the southern ridge after securing the perimeter. She was the last to sweep the northern quadrant, checking for any signs of life, human or animal, that might have been left behind. She had done this kind of work for 15 years. Wildfires, search and rescue, controlled burns. She had faced every kind of terrain, from pine-blanketed mountains to sun-baked deserts. But this fire felt different. Angrier, hungrier. Maybe it was the sheer speed of its spread, or the way the wind howled like a wounded creature through the dead trees. Or maybe it was something more personal, something Hannah couldn't quite name. She moved steadily through the haze, scanning the terrain like a hawk. Her breath came short and shallow from the smoke, but her focus remained sharp. Her gloved fingers brushed the trunks of charred trees, still warm to the touch. Every so often, glowing embers swirled through the air like tiny fireflies, beautiful and deadly. The roar of the approaching flames echoed faintly in the distance, a constant low growl that never ceased. Just as she was about to turn back, a flicker of movement caught her eye through the smoke, a blur of motion at the tree line near the ridge. She stopped cold. Squinting, she stepped closer, her boots crunching over brittle, blackened foliage. Another rustle, then the sharp, distinct sound of hoofbeats pounding against the dry earth. A horse? Her heart skipped. She hadn't expected that. She crept forward until the landscape opened up slightly, an overlook near the edge of a steep drop-off. There, silhouetted against the flames creeping up from below, stood a wild Mustang. Alone, cornered. The horse was a sight to behold, even through the dense smoke. His coat shimmered like bronze in the firelight, dappled with ash and streaked with sweat. Muscles rippled under his flanks as he shifted nervously, snorting hard and pawing the ground. His nostrils flared, sensing the danger that encircled him. The fire had cut off his escape from 3 sides. The only open path was the ridge, and even that was closing fast. The Mustang reared, shrieking into the suffocating air, then slammed back down with fury. He was trapped. Hannah felt a chill despite the heat that seared her skin. She knew wild Mustangs were elusive, fiercely independent. Most never came close to humans. But this one, majestic and full of fire himself, was about to be swallowed whole by the blaze. Her radio crackled violently. "Brooks, pull back now. I repeat, fall back to Zone 6 immediately. The ridge is unstable. You've got maybe 5 minutes before—" She yanked the radio from her vest and silenced it. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Something in her refused to turn away from that horse. Hannah wasn't the type to ignore orders, especially not on a burn this volatile. But she also wasn't the type to walk away from a life she knew she could save. She had seen death too often in this job. It had carved itself into her bones, worn her spirit thin. Every saved life, animal or human, mattered. Without hesitation, she adjusted the rope looped around her shoulder, stepped out from the cover of the trees, and slowly made her way toward the Mustang. The wind picked up. Ash rained down. The fire line behind them groaned as trees collapsed, coughing flames into the sky. The horse locked eyes with her. His ears twitched. He backed up a step but didn't bolt. There was something in his stance, tense but curious. His front hooves scraped the edge of the ridge, crumbling dirt tumbling into the abyss below. "Easy, boy," Hannah whispered, though her voice was nearly drowned by the wind and flame. She stopped a dozen feet away, keeping her posture low and unthreatening. The horse flared his nostrils again, ears rotating like radar dishes, gauging her intent. Every second counted. The fire was curling around behind them now. The clearing would be engulfed in less than a minute. If she lunged too fast, she'd spook him. If she waited too long, they'd both be swallowed whole. Hannah slowly unwrapped the bandana from around her neck. It was steeped in wild sage from earlier patrols, an old trick used by wranglers to calm nervous colts. She held it in the air and let the wind catch it, swaying it like a flag of peace. The Mustang didn't move, but he didn't bolt either. Something passed between them. Fear, yes, but also recognition. In that moment, amid the inferno closing in around them, two survivors, one human, one beast, stood on the same ground, both on the brink of being consumed. The fire screamed behind her, and Hannah took one more step. The flames crept higher behind her, licking at the blackened treetops like a demon's breath. Hannah didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on the Mustang, each of her movements deliberate and measured. The scarf in her hand fluttered weakly in the smoky air, the scent of sage barely able to push through the stench of burning resin and scorched earth. Still, she held it high, praying the old method would work one more time. The Mustang tossed his head again, his ears swiveling, trying to decide whether she was danger or salvation. His flanks were heaving, lungs struggling under the oppressive heat. Ash clung to his mane, which was tangled and wild like a creature forged from the storm. His front hooves shifted restlessly, one slipping slightly on the gravel near the ridge. The ground beneath him sloped sharply down to a canyon filled with boulders and broken timber. One wrong step, and he'd fall straight into the abyss. She saw the panic in his eyes. Animals knew when the end was near. His instincts screamed at him to run, to escape the crackling fury that surrounded them. But he had nowhere to go. The fire had curved around them, and the only open path was the narrow trail behind Hannah, barely wide enough for a human, let alone a horse. She took another step forward, her boots crunching on burnt pine needles. Slowly, she crouched, lowering herself to his eye level, keeping her frame non-threatening. Her hand moved to her belt, loosening the rope she had carried through 100 fires. It wasn't ideal, worn and frayed in a few spots, but it might be enough to guide him if she could get close. The Mustang pawed the dirt again, his nostrils flaring. He let out a high, piercing whinny and backed toward the edge, dangerously close to losing his balance. Hannah's heart pounded, not from fear of the fire, but fear of watching this animal plunge into death because she moved too fast. She dropped the scarf gently to the ground and retreated half a step. Let the wind carry the scent to him. Let him decide. Seconds passed. The crack of burning timber echoed from the tree line. The temperature spiked. hot enough to feel like the air itself was slicing her skin open. Then, he took one step forward. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The Mustang lowered his head slightly, sniffing the scarf. His body remained tense, ready to bolt, but his ears flicked forward now. Hannah felt a flicker of hope surge through her. She didn't speak. No sudden movements. Just a quiet, patient wait while nature decided whether to trust her. She reached slowly into her vest and pulled out a soft cloth strap, something she'd used once on a rescue mare who had gotten tangled in barbed wire near Flagstaff. She bunched it in her hand and let it dangle low, letting it sway like a vine. The Mustang's gaze shifted to it, not hostile, just wary. She moved with the pace of cooling lava, inch by inch, closing the distance between them. When she was within arm's reach, she extended the rope toward him, letting it brush the edge of his shoulder. He flinched. His front hoof struck the ground hard, kicking up a puff of ash, but he didn't bolt. Hannah exhaled through her teeth. Her fingers brushed his mane, coarse, singed at the tips, but still alive, still fighting. With one swift motion, she looped the rope loosely around his neck, not tight, not restraining, just enough to let him feel her presence. The Mustang shuddered, then froze. He let out a low, throaty exhale and stood still, eyes locked to hers. It was done. A tremor ran through the ground as another pine exploded in the distance, sending embers cascading into the sky like fireflies in reverse. The forest was collapsing around them. No time for hesitation. She gave the rope a light tug and took a step back toward the trail. The Mustang resisted just for a moment, then moved with her. One step, then another. Together they crossed the clearing, weaving through the skeletal remains of trees. The narrow trail ahead snaked along the ridge, bordered on one side by a sheer drop and on the other by dense thickets already glowing with fire's edge. The Mustang stumbled once but recovered. Hannah's grip tightened on the rope, guiding him with careful tension. Each stride they took away from the fire was a small defiance, a rebellion against the doom that had tried to claim them both. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The bond had formed, not forged by bridles or commands, but by smoke, heat, and the silent understanding that survival was now shared. Behind them, the inferno surged, consuming the place where they had stood. Ahead of them was only uncertainty. But they moved forward anyway. The trail narrowed quickly, hugging the steep curve of the ridge like a thread along a torn seam. Rocks shifted beneath Hannah's boots, and every step required calculated balance. The Mustang followed close behind her, muscles rippling beneath his soot-covered coat, his breath steaming in short, shallow bursts. The rope hung loosely between them, not a leash, but a fragile tether of trust. One mistake and the connection would snap. They hadn't gone more than 50 yards when her radio, clipped at her waist, cracked sharply to life. "Brooks, this is Captain Dillard. What's your status? You were supposed to fall back 10 minutes ago. Do you copy?" The voice, filled with urgency and command, seemed to cut through the layers of smoke and heat. She didn't respond. Her free hand hovered over the radio, hesitating, but the fire crackled louder in her ears than the orders she was trained to follow. There were rules, and then there were moments like this, where you followed your gut because nothing else made sense. "Brooks, respond! The North Ridge is unstable! Repeat, unstable! Get out of there now!" She yanked the radio from her belt and switched it off. Orders would have to wait. The fire was moving faster than forecasted. The wind had shifted again, pushing the wall of flame toward them from an angle no one had planned for. Embers fell like blackened snow from above, catching in the branches and igniting pockets of heat just feet from the trail. Every breath Hannah took tasted like smoke and desperation. The Mustang hesitated as they approached a sharp bend, his hooves skidding slightly on the gravel. Hannah paused, waiting, her body angled so he could see her clearly. Her own instincts screamed at her to hurry, to run, but wild animals didn't respond to panic. They responded to stillness, to confidence. She gave him that, even as her legs trembled beneath the weight of exhaustion and adrenaline. He moved again, one step, then two. The trail dipped into a shallow gulch littered with fallen branches and charred underbrush. Hannah guided Blaze. She had started to think of him by that name now, the fire reflected in his eyes, as carefully as she could, navigating around broken limbs and hidden roots. Then came the sound she had been dreading, the deep, rumbling crack of earth shifting under pressure. Ahead of them, a rock slide thundered down the side of the hill, spilling across the trail in a torrent of boulders, dirt, and splintered tree trunks. The path vanished beneath debris, completely blocked. They stopped in unison. The Mustang snorted and pawed the ground anxiously, sensing the dead end. Smoke thickened around them, the wind funneling down the ridge with savage force. The fire was coming fast, closing in behind them, and now their only route forward was buried. Panic pressed against the edges of Hannah's mind, but she shoved it down with practiced force. She scanned the area. The ridge sloped sharply, but to the left, just below a leaning pine, was a dip in the terrain. An old game trail, overgrown and narrow, but passable. Maybe, if they moved fast. She unclipped the coil of emergency rope from her pack and began working quickly, anchoring it to a sturdy trunk. The Mustang stood still, watching her, ears pinned back against the rising wail of the firestorm. She didn't look at him as she worked. No time for fear. No time for questions. She dragged several fallen branches across the slide, forming a rough platform over the worst of the rubble. It wasn't elegant, and it wouldn't hold long, but it might be enough. The Mustang would have to trust her again, and she would have to trust herself. She stepped onto the makeshift bridge first. It groaned under her weight, but held. One step, then another. She reached the other side, turned, and tugged gently on the rope. The Mustang balked. The fire screamed behind them. Ash swirled in dense clouds as a tree nearby exploded in a shower of sparks. The trail they had come from lit up with sudden flame. There was no going back now. She braced herself, tightening the rope. Blaze pawed the ground again, then lunged forward. His hooves struck the first set of branches with force. For a second, Hannah thought the whole thing would collapse. But the Mustang powered forward, legs pumping like pistons, and leapt across the unstable section in one final push. His back legs struck the edge and slipped, but she caught the rope and yanked hard, helping him scramble to safety. He landed beside her, panting, coated in sweat and ash. The bridge collapsed behind them. They didn't stop. No more time to check the radio. No more time for second-guessing. Hannah pressed forward, leading the way down the shadowed slope of the next ridge, guiding Blaze through the chaos as burning debris fell from the sky. The fire was behind them. The unknown was ahead. But they moved forward together, one step at a time. They descended into a narrow valley between scorched ridges, the landscape dark with ash and littered with smoking remnants of what once had been lush forest. The air clung thick to the skin, heavy with the scent of burned sap and damp earth trying to rise through the destruction. The fire still roared in the distance, a monster bellowing as it devoured the trees behind them. But here, for a fleeting moment, there was a breath of space, enough to pause, enough to regroup. Hannah slowed to a stop near a shallow creek bed, its muddy trickle barely surviving the drought. Her lungs ached from the climb, and her knees trembled with exhaustion, but her attention remained fixed on the Mustang. He stood a few paces away, muscles taut, flanks heaving. His eyes darted from side to side, always searching for escape, always calculating whether the rope around his neck was a threat or a lifeline. She loosened it, not enough to lose hold, but enough to give him space. She had pushed him hard through that last stretch, and he had followed. Not because she forced him, she couldn't have if she tried, but because something unspoken had passed between them. Still, trust earned in fire was brittle. One misstep could shatter it completely. She crouched slowly and pulled off one of her gloves, letting the hot wind kiss her hand as she reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers found what she was looking for: dried apple slices wrapped in foil, half crushed from the journey. She peeled one out and laid it gently on a flat stone between them, then backed away without a word. The Mustang watched her with suspicion, ears flicking. His hooves shuffled in the soot. He took a single step forward, then stopped, snorting sharply as if reminding her he was no fool. Still, the scent of the apple lingered in the air, cutting through the smoke. Temptation mingled with instinct. Hannah didn't look at him directly. Instead, she turned her eyes to the valley beyond, pretending to rest, though her heart beat a steady rhythm of hope. Let him decide. No tricks, no pressure. After what felt like minutes, she heard the soft scrape of hooves on rock. He was moving. A quiet crunch followed. The apple was gone. She smiled, just barely. The Mustang lifted his head, staring at her for a long, tense moment. She didn't move. Then he lowered his head again, not out of submission but recognition. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a beginning. She rose carefully and walked toward him, stopping just outside the reach of the rope. Slowly, she pulled her scarf from around her neck, the one she had used to get his attention in the clearing. It was streaked with ash now, but the faint scent of sage still clung to it. She lifted it gently, letting it flutter again in the wind. The Mustang flinched at first, then stilled. His ears flicked back, then forward. He didn't bolt. She stepped closer, holding the scarf out. The fabric danced in the breeze between them like a whisper. His nose twitched. He took a hesitant step forward and touched the cloth, brushing it with his muzzle. Hannah held her breath. Then, in one smooth motion, she reached up and ran her fingers through the tangled strands of his mane. He didn't pull away. Her fingers moved slowly, feeling the grit, the ash, the heat trapped in his coat. Beneath the grime, she could feel the strength of his muscles, the raw power of an animal built for endurance, for freedom. This horse had survived in the wild without the touch of humans, and now he stood with her, bruised, battered, yet still standing. Behind them, the fire's growl deepened again. The valley was no haven. It was only a temporary pause. They had to keep moving. The path ahead twisted through old growth, some of it still untouched, but not for long. The wind was shifting again. She tightened the rope, not enough to restrain, just enough to guide. This time, when she stepped forward, he followed without hesitation. They climbed another narrow ridge, the trail barely visible through the haze. She spoke softly to him now, not in commands, but murmured phrases carried on breath. Words of reassurance, rhythm without meaning, tones shaped by calm. She didn't need him to understand. She needed him to stay. As they moved deeper into the forest, the smoke began to thin for the first time in hours. Shafts of sunlight cut through the haze above, illuminating patches of green that had somehow escaped the flames. Small signs of life, ferns still curled along the ground, a bird darting between branches, offered a fragile kind of hope. They kept moving, each step a quiet agreement, each pause a test of the fragile link between them. And when they crested the ridge and looked out over the next valley, one still unburned for now, Hannah reached up again, this time not to control, but simply to brush a clump of ash from his forehead. He let her. That was enough. The valley below held the illusion of safety. From their vantage point, Hannah could see the swaying tops of pine and juniper, untouched by flame, still green, still alive. But she knew better than to trust appearances in a wildfire. Smoke curled at the edges of the horizon, rising steadily in distant plumes. The inferno was circling, unpredictable, like a predator hunting in silence. Time was slipping through their fingers. She adjusted her grip on the rope gently, sensing Blaze's growing restlessness. The Mustang's ears twitched constantly, his head turning at every sound. Though he had accepted her presence, he remained alert, ready to run if instincts called. The tension between them was a fragile thread, made stronger by need, yet always one wrong moment away from snapping. They descended the slope cautiously. The trail here was uneven, littered with dry branches and scorched bark. Some of the trees had burned from the inside out, standing as hollow, smoking shells waiting to collapse. Ash fell intermittently from above, drifting through shafts of light like black snow. Beneath her boots, the ground was soft and unstable. Every step had to be tested before she put her full weight down. They made steady progress for half a mile. Blaze moved with impressive agility for a horse unfamiliar with the guidance of humans. His hooves found purchase where none should exist, navigating tight corners and slippery ridges with instinctual grace. Hannah let him lead when he needed to, offering only the lightest pressure through the rope, enough to guide but not command. Then came the sound she dreaded, the low rumble of shifting earth. It began subtly, like a groan beneath the surface, but within seconds, the slope ahead trembled. Rocks cracked loose. The trail, narrow and built on years of erosion, began to crumble. A section of hillside just ahead of them gave way in a sudden landslide, branches, roots, and debris tumbling downward in a roaring cascade. Hannah stopped in her tracks. Blaze reared slightly, his front hooves striking dirt as he backed up. Dust filled the air, and with it came the distinct scent of heat. Closer now. The fire had pushed forward again, likely redirected by wind through the upper canyons. Their route was gone. She turned quickly, scanning the terrain. The left slope was too steep, riddled with unstable rock. The right side dropped into a gulch filled with thick undergrowth, flammable and dry. But then, beyond a cluster of fallen timber, she saw a possibility. A low, sloping ledge ran across a rock face just wide enough for a person, and maybe a horse. It wasn't a trail. It wasn't meant to be crossed. But they didn't have another option. She tugged the rope gently, directing Blaze toward the ledge. He resisted, snorting hard, hooves skidding on the uneven dirt. She released tension from the line and approached him carefully, resting a hand on his neck. His skin was hot beneath her palm, slick with sweat and ash. No words, just a moment of stillness. She moved toward the ledge, testing each step. The stone beneath her boots crumbled in flakes, but it held, just wide enough. She reached the midpoint and turned. Blaze remained frozen, unsure. One foot shifted forward, then back again. A gust of wind blew up from behind them, carrying with it the unmistakable crackle of flame and the searing scent of pine igniting. The fire had found the trees they'd just left. The noise was deafening, wood splitting, fire roaring, the air itself vibrating from heat. Hannah held her breath. Then Blaze jumped forward. He didn't hesitate this time. His front hooves struck the ledge with force, but he kept going, muscles coiling as he balanced his weight. The rope went taut for a heartbeat, and then slackened as he moved beside her. His body brushed hers, tense and powerful. Together, they crossed the ledge, inch by inch. Below them, ash swirled through the canyon. The fire raced behind, consuming what they'd escaped. When they finally reached solid ground, both of them stood breathless. Hannah collapsed to one knee, muscles screaming, lungs burning from exertion. Blaze lowered his head, sides heaving, but still upright, still strong. She looked up through the smoke and saw daylight breaking through a gap in the ridge above, a golden sliver cutting through the gray. It wasn't the end, not yet, but it was something to aim for. She rose again, tightening the strap on her glove. Her fingers brushed the rope around Blaze's neck, not as a tool of restraint, but as a symbol of survival. They pressed forward. The mountain rose before them like a jagged scar against the smoke-choked sky. The trail had disappeared entirely, swallowed by crumbling ledges and falling ash. To the left, a ravine yawned open, a deep, winding gorge carved by ancient floods and now filled with shadow. On the right, walls of rock jutted upward like the ribs of some buried beast. There was nowhere flat, nowhere safe, only upward. Hannah didn't hesitate. She led Blaze to the edge of a sloping rock face that curved along the side of the mountain, narrowing to little more than a shelf barely wide enough for her boots. Below it, the land fell away into the ravine, steep and merciless. The Mustang followed close, nostrils flaring, his body bristling with tension. Every step he took was a gamble against gravity and instinct. Their world had narrowed to that strip of rock, crumbling, uneven, sloping dangerously in places. There was no margin for error. The heat clawed at their backs, the fire following like a hunter who had spotted its prey. A rock beneath Hannah's foot shifted. She dropped to one knee. Catching herself with her gloved hand, her breath knocked from her lungs. Loose shale skittered down the slope and vanished into the void below. She froze, heart pounding, and turned just enough to see Blaze behind her, stiff, his front hooves trembling on the edge, head high and eyes wide with panic. He reared suddenly. His front hooves slipped. Time slowed. The rope jerked in Hannah's hand, nearly pulling her off the ledge as Blaze's rear legs scrambled for purchase. His body twisted sideways, one hoof scraping desperately at the stone. For a split second, he hung between safety and the abyss. She didn't think. She lunged forward, slamming her weight into the ground and driving her boots into a crevice in the rock. Her hands gripped the rope like iron, arms straining, shoulders burning. The rope cut into her palm through the glove, biting hard. Blaze thrashed, hooves chipping the rock. His body sagged dangerously toward the edge. "Hold on," she breathed, more to herself than to him. The weight dragged against her spine, a force she couldn't fight for long, but then His hooves caught. His chest slammed into the ledge, then his front legs. A final heave, and he scrambled fully onto the narrow path. Hannah collapsed onto her side, gasping, the rope still clenched in her fist. For a moment, neither of them moved. Smoke curled around them like mist, and the distant roar of the wildfire rolled like thunder through the canyon. Blaze stood trembling, flanks soaked in sweat. But he didn't run. His eyes flicked to her. His body still shook from panic, but he stepped closer, just one stride, and nudged her shoulder with his nose. It wasn't fear. It was acknowledgement. Hannah slowly sat up, pain flaring in her arms and back. She reached into her jacket and pulled the scarf free, the same faded piece of cloth that had calmed him before. She let it hang in the air between them, the scent of sage barely rising now through the smoke. He lowered his head and brushed his muzzle against it, breathing slowly, more steady now. The wind howled down the ravine. Somewhere behind them, trees collapsed, sending waves of flame rolling like surf through the brush. The fire had changed direction again, no longer chasing directly, but sweeping wide to cut off escape further north. They were being funneled, herded like prey toward a single narrowing path. Hannah rose to her feet and scanned the terrain. There was a small ridge ahead, barely a rise, more a pile of rock and old tree roots, but beyond it, she saw light, a flicker of gold piercing the gloom, the sign of thinning smoke, possibly an exit, possibly nothing. But it was the only direction left. They moved carefully now, side by side, no longer bound by the rope. Blaze followed without prompting, his shoulder brushing hers when the path narrowed too tight for distance. Each step along the ledge echoed with danger. The ravine still waiting below, the fire breathing down their necks. At one point, the trail disappeared entirely. A rock slide had carved a sheer drop across the path, 5 feet wide and too deep to jump blindly. Hannah didn't wait. She dropped to her knees and began laying down a crossing, dragging dead branches from a nearby snag and jamming them between stones, testing for weight. Blaze waited behind her, pacing slightly, eyes on the fire rising beyond the bend. The makeshift bridge held, barely. She crossed first, then turned and called him, not with words, but with her presence, her posture, her stillness. He hesitated for one long moment, then crossed. They crested the ridge as dusk began to fall, the world dimming into a smoky, ember-lit twilight. What lay ahead wasn't safety, not yet, but it was open. The valley stretched forward, unburned for now, filled with boulders and dry stream beds, the scent of water hidden somewhere far ahead. Hannah rested her hand on Blaze's neck. He didn't flinch. They had passed the edge, and they had not fallen. The valley ahead should have offered relief, a wide stretch of rocky terrain spotted with sparse trees and dry grass. But as Hannah and Blaze moved forward, the fire followed, relentless and cunning. The wind had shifted again, sweeping flames down from the ridge they had just escaped, wrapping the inferno in a horseshoe around their position. Smoke thickened once more, this time darker, more acrid, as if the fire had found new fuel and was racing to claim what it missed. Their pace quickened. Blaze stayed close now, no longer needing the rope. He moved at Hannah's side like they had trained for years together, dodging debris and stepping in rhythm, as though he understood their survival depended on keeping the pace, staying together. The ground trembled beneath them, a low, rolling quake as a massive tree cracked behind them and toppled, its flaming trunk striking the earth with a deafening roar. Sparks exploded outward, raining down like burning needles. Hannah didn't look back. She focused ahead, narrowing her vision to the path between two granite outcrops where the air still shimmered from heat but hadn't yet caught fire. She ran. Not sprinting, there wasn't room or strength for that, but a steady, pounding rhythm through the uneven terrain. Boots scraping rock, lungs burning, eyes half-blind from smoke. Blaze surged beside her, powerful and tireless. But the fire was faster. A burst of flame leapt from the brush ahead, licking across their escape route like a serpent striking. Blaze reared, nearly colliding with her, hooves smashing against stone. Hannah stumbled sideways, crashing down hard onto her side. Her ankle twisted beneath her, and pain ripped up her leg like lightning. She gritted her teeth, rolled onto her back, and tried to stand. The joint gave out immediately. Flames snapped close now, just yards away. The fire had curved around in a tight arc and was pushing straight for them. Blaze circled her in confusion, ears flattened, eyes wide with fear. He pawed the ground near her boots, nostrils flaring. She reached for the rope, but her hand trembled with pain. Her ankle was done. She could barely move. Still, she pushed up onto one knee. She would not die here. Not now. The heat bit at her skin through her suit. Embers stuck to her sleeves, her neck. She batted them off, then crawled forward, dragging her injured leg through the ash. Blaze stepped in front of her, shielding her from the incoming sparks with his body, his frame solid and unmoving despite the chaos around them. Another tree cracked. This one fell just behind them, flames erupting from its branches as it struck the ground. The shock wave sent ash swirling and knocked Hannah flat again. Pain surged from her ankle to her hip. Her vision blurred. Blaze stayed. He didn't bolt. He didn't rear. He stood over her, ears twitching, chest rising and falling like a war drum, his stance planted in the dirt. Through the haze of pain, Hannah saw his silhouette through the smoke, strong, steady, and unbreakable. Somehow, that gave her strength. She gripped his rope again, using it to pull herself upright. Her body shook, and the pain lanced every step, but she refused to stop. Her boot barely touched the ground now. She hopped and leaned on Blaze, using his body like a crutch. They moved slowly, painfully, but they moved. Through fire, over blackened roots and smoking stone. Around them, the world burned, and still they pushed forward, battered by wind and smoke. A gust sent a shower of sparks cascading across their backs. Blaze flinched, but didn't leave her side. Hannah clutched his mane now, fingers buried in ash and tangled hair. She could barely breathe. The land began to rise again. Another slope, but this one was their only way out. The air thinned slightly as they climbed, and the sound of the fire, though still ever present, grew quieter with each step. But her ankle screamed with every movement, and her strength waned. Her knee buckled halfway up. She dropped hard against Blaze, nearly collapsing. He shifted to catch her weight, standing firm. Then, to her surprise, he began to move again, upward. Slow, careful steps. He guided her along, keeping her upright as she leaned fully on him. Together, they reached the crest. The view was a miracle. Below them stretched a rocky basin, blackened in some parts, but not engulfed. The fire hadn't reached it yet. A narrow creek shimmered through the center, barely more than a trickle, but it was water. Safe ground. Hannah collapsed to her knees, gasping, trembling, but alive. Blaze stood beside her, head lifted to the sky, his body streaked with soot and his flanks heaving, but still full of that fierce, defiant strength. They had outrun the worst. For now. The basin below felt like a different world, quieter, dimmer, and somehow calmer. The fire still loomed behind them, its glow painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red, but the wind had shifted once more. The flames turned away, chasing oxygen in another direction, sparing this sliver of land, at least for now. But Hannah knew better than to call it safety. In wildfire country, nothing stayed safe for long. She sat at the edge of a dry stream bed, her back against a slab of cooled granite. Her breaths ragged and uneven. The pain in her ankle had intensified, radiating sharp pulses up through her calf and thigh. Her boot was swollen tight around the joint, her entire leg stiff with inflammation and dirt. Every movement brought a new jolt of agony. Blaze stood nearby, hooves rooted in place, ears flicking with every sound. His sides still rose and fell from the run, but his posture was alert, watching, waiting, not pacing anymore, not searching for escape. He wasn't thinking of himself. He was watching her. Hannah tried to stand again, bracing herself against the rock, but her leg buckled and she fell back down, gritting her teeth. The impact sent a searing pain through her hip, and for the first time, tears stung her eyes. Not from fear, not from the fire, but from sheer exhaustion and helplessness. She had pushed through every obstacle. She had risked everything to save him. And now, when they were so close, her body had betrayed her. The fire hadn't beaten her. Her own legs had. She leaned her head back, eyes closed, breath shallow. Smoke still lingered in the air, though it was lighter here, and she could see slivers of stars overhead through the thin veil of ash. A strange quiet had settled. No birds, no insects, just the low hum of distant flame and the occasional crack of something collapsing behind them. She felt warmth brush her shoulder. Blaze. He had stepped closer and now stood beside her. His body a wall of heat and muscle. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered his head and nudged her arm, not hard, just enough to stir her from despair. She looked at him, barely able to focus through the fatigue, and saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Not fear, not panic. Purpose. Blaze shifted, lowering his body slightly, then angled his flank toward her, close enough that she could reach. It took her a moment to understand what he was offering. He wasn't waiting to be led anymore. He was taking the lead. Her fingers trembled as she reached up and gripped his mane, feeling the matted strands beneath her glove. With a grunt, she pulled herself upright, wobbling on one leg, and leaned her full weight against his side. He didn't move. He stood perfectly still, waiting for her to find balance. Then, slowly, he took a step. And she followed. Together they began to walk, if it could be called walking. She half hobbled, half dragged herself along, leaning on Blaze's strength for every stride. His pace was careful, measured. He stopped when she stumbled, shifted when her weight slipped. There was no resistance in him now, no hesitation. He had become her anchor. The terrain wasn't easy. Rocks shifted beneath them, and the slope dipped toward a narrow passage lined with boulders. In the dark, it was hard to tell where the path ended and danger began, but Blaze never wavered. His hooves landed with certainty, his movements sure. He picked the route as though he knew the way by instinct alone. Each time she faltered, he adjusted. When her leg gave out completely, he waited, standing over her, as if guarding her from the shadows. Hours passed this way, or maybe minutes. Time lost all shape in the exhaustion. But eventually, They reached the far edge of the basin, where the ground rose again into a canyon wall. It wasn't steep, but the climb would be brutal. The stone was cracked and uneven, dotted with exposed roots and sharp ledges. No trail, no clear path, just rock. Hannah looked up and almost laughed. She didn't have it in her, but Blaze moved first. He climbed, not fast, but with determination, hooves finding purchase along ridges, shoulders rippling with power. He paused halfway up, turned his head and looked back, waiting. She gritted her teeth and began crawling, using hands and her one good leg, dragging herself up like some broken thing clawing through rubble. The rope between them had long since fallen, but the connection held. She moved because he was moving. She pushed forward because he waited for her. He led her through the most treacherous spots, stopping when she slipped, giving her time to regain control. The climb felt endless, but inch by inch, they reached the top. When she pulled herself over the final ledge and lay flat, gasping, Blaze was already beside her, standing tall beneath a sky slowly lightening at the edges with the first trace of dawn. They had survived the worst of it, together. But they were not finished. Morning came slowly, spilling over the horizon like a whisper rather than a fanfare. The fire still burned somewhere behind them, but its roar had faded into distant rumble. In its place, a heavy silence lingered, ash-laced and fragile, like the aftermath of a storm too large to comprehend. Hannah lay flat on the rocky plateau, her face turned toward the pale sky, one hand resting on her chest. Her breathing was slow and uneven, every rib bruised from the night's brutal climb. The pain in her ankle had dulled into a deep, constant throb. She knew something was torn or fractured. The swelling had worsened, creeping halfway up her calf now. She couldn't walk anymore, at least not on her own, but they had made it. She turned her head to where Blaze stood, only a few feet away. His coat, once gleaming bronze, was now dulled with soot and streaks of dried sweat. His mane was tangled, and his body bore scratches from falling branches, sharp rocks, and flying debris. Yet he stood proud, strong legs rooted to the earth, head high, eyes clear. Not untouched, but unbroken. He had saved her. In a career built on sacrifice and survival, Hannah had never leaned so completely on another living being. Not like this. Not with this kind of trust. And never with something as wild, as free, as untamed as Blaze. The canyon ahead was quiet. Below them, a narrow game trail wound through low brush and scattered stone outcroppings. Beyond that, the beginnings of a gravel road glimmered faintly in the morning sun. It was faint, hard to spot from above, but it was real. She recognized the utility posts half buried in overgrowth. Civilization wasn't far now. She could radio from there, get evac, get help, get out. But she couldn't take him. Wild horses didn't belong in trailers, under shelter, behind fences. They belonged out here, in the open, where their instincts ruled and their blood ran with wind and thunder. Blaze had already given her more than anyone had the right to ask. She didn't want to let him go, but she had to. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the rope loosely draped around his neck. He stood still, watching her, unmoving as she untied the knot and let it slip free. The rope dropped to the ground between them. The weight of the moment pressed hard on her chest. She met his gaze one last time. The sun had reached his eyes now, lighting them gold. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just looked at her, ears forward, head tilted slightly, like he was waiting for something more. A word, a sign. anything. She gave him nothing. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight, and her heart had already begun the breaking. Blaze stepped back. His hooves moved with purpose now, careful and deliberate. He turned toward the game trail, the same way they'd come. The way home. The early breeze ruffled his mane, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. His muscles bunched as he prepared to descend. She lowered her eyes, unable to watch, but the silence lingered, longer than it should have. She lifted her head again. He hadn't left. He stood still at the edge of the ridge, his body turned toward the trail, but his head twisted back toward her. His ears flicked, his gaze locked on hers. The wind shifted slightly, swirling dust and loose ash between them. And then he came back, not slowly, not hesitantly. He trotted the few steps back to her side and stopped, standing over her once more like a sentinel. He lowered his head and gently pressed his muzzle to her shoulder, breathing in the scent that had come to mean safety. The scarf still hung from her jacket, faintly scented with sage and sweat. His nostrils flared once, then calmed. She didn't understand, but she felt it. He had made his choice. Blaze had the chance to return to the wild. To leave, to be free again, and instead, he chose to stay. The emotion hit her like a wave. Her hand reached up, not to control, but to touch, just to feel. Her fingers brushed his jawline, ran up the side of his face to his ears. He leaned into her hand, not forcefully, but gently, accepting the contact, sharing it. It wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a bond. No reins, no commands, no walls between them, just two survivors, scarred and soot-covered, who had endured something no one else could ever fully understand. And now, standing in the cool light of morning, neither wanted to be alone. They had crossed fire together. That changed everything. The sun had fully risen now, spreading pale gold across the canyon walls, turning the scorched landscape into a quiet mosaic of survival. Smoke still hovered in the air, light and gray, drifting lazily like a memory. The wind was calm for the first time in days, no longer driving flame or fury, but simply passing through, a witness to what remained. Hannah leaned against a low boulder at the edge of the ridge, one arm draped over her knee, the other resting gently on Blaze's neck. Her breath came easier now, though every muscle ached and her ankle throbbed with dull fire. She had wrapped it tightly with the last strip of cloth from her kit and braced it with a broken limb, just stable enough to move again if she had to. But for now, she stayed still. So did Blaze. He stood beside her with quiet certainty, no longer scanning the horizon for danger. His body, though marked by soot and ash, radiated calm. No saddle, no halter, no tether. Yet he hadn't strayed a single step since returning to her. They watched the basin below together. Down near the tree line, a trail vehicle shimmered in the sunlight. She recognized it by its wide orange stripe, search and rescue. Reinforcements must have circled around the fire after the wind shift. Soon, they'd be here. Soon, she'd be pulled out, flown back to the base camp, wrapped in clean blankets and pumped full of fluids. Her body needed it. Her leg couldn't take much more, but she kept her eyes on Blaze. When the team arrived, they'd ask questions. They'd want to contain him, guide him, tag him, maybe even relocate him. That was protocol. No wild horse was supposed to stay near humans, especially not after a disaster like this. He was supposed to run back into the mountains, find his herd, disappear into the wind. But he hadn't. She had given him the choice. and he had come back. She shifted her hand, brushing a patch of dried mud from his coat. The gesture was small, almost instinctive, but it meant everything. It said, "You're safe now, if you still want to be here." The wind picked up gently, lifting the scarf still tied at her belt. The faint scent of sage remained, mixed now with smoke and sweat and ash. Blaze caught the scent and flicked his ears, his head turning toward her once more. Then, without sound or signal, he lowered his head and pressed it against her chest. The contact was steady, unmoving, absolute. Hannah felt the last of her defenses fall. She closed her eyes and let her hand slide up along his neck, fingers tracing the hard lines of muscle beneath his skin. There was no fear left between them, no distance, just presence, just truth. Minutes passed that way. The morning deepened. Insects began to stir beneath the rocks. A bird chirped, sharp, high, alive. Somewhere down in the canyon, a branch cracked. A human voice echoed faintly. They were coming. She looked down the slope, watching the movement of orange jackets in the brush, the flash of gear, the rhythm of trained feet. A medic raised a hand, calling to her. Hannah didn't respond right away. She simply stayed still, letting the moment hold. She knew what this meant. She could leave now, but not without him. As the team approached, Blaze stiffened slightly. His ears perked toward the noise. His body leaned forward as though weighing the next step. Go or stay, run or follow. Hannah shifted her weight and stood, wincing but steady. Blaze looked at her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. And he stayed. The team reached her within minutes. Words buzzing, hands outstretched, radios crackling. Someone moved toward Blaze cautiously, ready to control or calm or catch. But Hannah raised a hand. Low, firm, quiet. Not this one. Not him. He isn't just a survivor. He's mine. They led her to the rescue vehicle, easing her into the seat, wrapping her in a foil blanket, checking vitals and dressings. Blaze followed, never more than 2 paces behind. They looked at her like she was crazy. A wild Mustang? Following orders? She didn't explain. Some things didn't need explaining. As the doors closed and the truck began to crawl back down the gravel road, Hannah watched through the open window as Blaze trotted beside them. Not fearful. Not lost. Just present. The fire was far behind them now, but the bond, raw, wordless, real, was just beginning. Sometimes it's in the heart of the fire that we discover the truest strength, not in how we survive alone, but in how we learn to trust, to lead, and to be led. Blaze and Hannah didn't just survive the wildfire. They found each other inside it. And from that fire, something unbreakable was born.